there, gang. It's Headstock time once again. It's summer. Picture it. There's a weather-beaten old farmer. He's bent with the effects of time and honest labor. So he steps out onto the dusty homestead porch with his little grandson in tow, and he looks out across the land, surveying it. He tips his hat back on his head, turns his face to the sky, and listens intently. "Hear that, boy? That's the sound of headstocks crackling. It'll be a bumper crop for sure." So, some of you guys got real excited when you saw this color scheme. Hold your horses. This is the Epiphone version. Groan, complain, whine, boo, yeah, whatever. This is the Tom DeLonge Signature 333 Epiphone. You want the history? In the early 2000s, Gibson came out with a stripped-down, budget-conscious ES335 style dot neck guitar. It had a satin finish. It had no pickguard. There was no fancy inlay for the headstock, just a silk screen. It had the usual number of pickups, but they came without covers. And wonder of wonders, the thing actually had an access plate in the back. So they cost considerably less than the big kid version, so everyone bought them. Therefore, Gibson had to put an end to it because they were stealing sales from the upscale model. I think they lasted 2 or 3 years. At around the same time, they were also coming out with a bunch of limited run signature models for various artists, who, although they were well known, are not really considered like guitar hero types. They made one for Chris Cornell. They made that Pelham Blue Trini Lopez kind of thing for Dave Grohl. Chad Kroeger from Nickelback actually managed to get a Les Paul. And Tom DeLonge of Blink-182 got this thing. Now, Tom chose the ES333 as his starting point, but he asked for just one single bridge pickup, making what is essentially an ES Junior. It happens to be a Dirty Fingers pickup, which is a very high output humbucker that Gibson designed in the 70s. Very high, like 15K ohms, twice the output of standard PAF. He also dispensed with the tone control, so it's dead simple. They came up with the racing stripe and this grayish brown body, and there you go. So they made them for a couple of years, and then it went away. Somehow, these signature models have become very hot on the secondary market. There aren't that many of them, and of course collectors do go a little bit crazy sometimes, but also think about the buyer in 2007 who walks into a music store with money in his hand. He knows he wants an ES-style guitar. Would he buy the one with the single bridge pickup and no tone control? Very uncharacteristic of what we imagine these things to be. They listed for around $2,000, but you would have to be a fan, right, to get this one? So they're scarce, and therefore collectible, and some of them go for $6,000 now. Actually, this just reminded me. I got an email several months back from a player who wanted my input because he'd actually managed to find one of the original Gibsons for sale in Australia, but it had a pretty nasty crack in the back of the neck, and he asked, was it a good idea for him to try and buy this thing with the expectation that I might be able to fix it, even though I hadn't actually had it in my hands. So that's what it's like. It's hard enough to find one for sale that shipping a broken one internationally somehow makes sense. So I told him that I wouldn't be able to make it look unbroken, so we both came to the conclusion that it wasn't really a good investment for him. For an Epiphone remake, these aren't that inexpensive either. I think they came out in 2013 or 14. I'm not exactly sure. This one was built in 2017, and I believe they were discontinued shortly thereafter. So they were only around for a couple of years, like basically the same length of time as the Gibson originals. And if what I'm seeing online is correct, they've also actually gained value on the coattails of the original's popularity since they were discontinued, which is something you don't expect from a modern Epiphone guitar. They generally don't appreciate, especially one that's only 3 or 4 years old. Now, here's the issue. It's bad. It's also compounded by something in the design. On this model, both Gibson and Epiphone, there is no headstock faceplate. 99% of the guitars built with an angled headstock have a piece of thick veneer on this front surface. Sometimes it's a composite material, sometimes it's solid wood, sometimes it's even plastic. And that does a couple of things. If the neck has been put together with a scarf joint, which is an angled cut that's glued together, it will disguise that joint if you look at it from the front. On one-piece necks, it helps to bolster what is known as short grain, which is much weaker than the continuous grain you'd find up in the body of the neck, because where you cut through the board here at an angle, the individual strands of grain are only about like 5/8 of an inch long as they pass through the board, 16 millimeters or so. So they separate easily. It's easier to break at this point, much like the boards used for demonstrations of karate. So this is the same old story. I've explained it, 3 or 4 times now in other videos. So I think I'll try and get some nice atmospheric shots of me carving and routing. One thing, this being a natural colored neck, it's not going to be picture perfect when it's done, and the customer knows that. I can't hide the seams with paint in this case, so I'm going to try and keep the inlays pretty symmetrical so it's at least visually appealing, because they're probably going to call attention to themselves, and he's okay with that. You can see that around the break there are large fragments of mahogany missing. And it's the same on the back. Big chunks of blowout around the break. I'd like to keep the headstock face in one plane as much as possible. And it would be nice to have something flat, like this chunk of UHMW, attached to what's left of the nut side here. I think I'll put some tape on there and super glue it in place so it won't move around while I get things aligned and clamped up. Of course, if I add tape over here, I should also put an equivalent thickness of tape on this one too, so that we're not introducing error. I'm not too worried about the surface in here because I'm going to have to inlay something over all of this mess anyway. Most of this is going to get cut away before we're done. I'm applying some wax to the truss rod nut. I'm using tight bond style glue for this, aliphatic polyvinyl. Some people don't like the idea, contending that it might creep over time, but the way I see it, with the number of pieces I'm going to be inserting into this thing, it would have to creep in 3 different planes at once, which seems unlikely to me. Of course, if it's stored in a hot car in Death Valley, all bets are off. I'll take some pains to get things aligned as well as possible. At this point, I'm most concerned with making the 2 halves hold together long enough to introduce the spline inlays. That's where all the strength is going to come from. Here's a simple router template. By flipping it over, I can do both sides of the neck. A piece of tape helps mark the upper end of the mortise. And a strip down the center is just a little wider than the truss rod channel inside the neck. It reminds me not to cut into it. To improve the router's angle of attack, I affix a cork riser that pushes up that side of the template and also keeps the corner of the template from denting the wood. I cover it with tape and actually super glue the template in place. Here I'm measuring the optimal depth of my router bit. Here's the first rabbet cut to depth. You can see that it starts just under the level of the fingerboard on one side and not through the face of the headstock on the other. Here I'm preparing a blank for the plug, and I'm pretty careful to get the length just right. You know, when things are fitting nicely, it's usually accompanied by a satisfying clicking sound. Following that, I can mark out the radius on the ends using a template. It's just a guide. Start off with a sanding block and then switch to fine files. That sounds and feels just about right. So I'll get that glued in place, and I'll use surgical tubing to cinch it up tight. Here's a similar rectangle template, which I'll use to bridge those 2 outside ones. This will get clamped and glued into place. And I'm using a hinge mortising bit, which is useful for this kind of thing. It has a bearing on top, like any regular pattern cutting bit, but the length is only 1/2 inch long. That means for shallow mortises like this, I don't need an excessively thick template. It would have to be like 1.25 inches thick. I can get away with 3/4. That fits nicely. You can see I left a lot of extra material to pare away. On other occasions I've been smarter and bandsawed those plugs to remove most of the waste before gluing. For the front surface of the headstock, I decided to make a radius routing template. On other occasions I've just made a rectangular plug, but this seems like an elegant solution to the problem. I'll cut this to a depth of about 2.5 millimeters, which doesn't take very long. Just have to be careful not to cut into the end of the fingerboard, because that would be really bad. Before gluing something in place, I will cover over the truss rod cavity with a piece of tape. To make the matching plug, I found a decent piece of mahogany and measured out the distance between the pin and the radius. Then I used my low-tech scribing compass that has a little blade in it. The steel pin rides in a small inset bushing in my workboard. I cut in gently from both faces, progressively going deeper, and it makes a very neat, accurate circle. I'll just test the fit. It's pretty nice. In order to inset it, I have to make it an accurate length, so I scribe a line under the nut and pare away the excess. That gets glued in and clamped between some cork-backed cauls. Once inlaid, there's still about 1 millimeter standing proud of the surface, which I get rid of with the block plane and some sanding. I've buried the access to the truss rod, so I now need to excavate it, and carefully pare back the edges of the overlay. Inlay? I guess it's both ways. I'll start sculpting the plugs by first bringing down the edges flush with the surrounding wood. Then I can remove the bulk of the material between these edges, trying to make a nice curve that continues what's on the neck. I use files, knives, sandpaper on a dowel, whatever's necessary, until it finally looks like this. Here I'm shoe shining with some fine sandpaper to blend the new in with the old. I want to make it feel like a continuation of what's already there. People keep asking what the pink rubber spatula that shows up in the background is for. Well, it's for times like this when I want to use medium viscosity super glue as a pore filler. This stuff works well. You want to wear a respirator because the fumes are super nasty, and goggles. I want to say goggles, people, because it irritates the eyes. I just sort of spatula it on pretty thick and then sand back down to level with some, I think it's 320 grit sandpaper. But it makes a good filler. I'll mist on 2 light coats of lacquer, which will act as a sort of base or a primer for color coats. Then it's time to mask off the binding. The neck has been tinted with something that's sort of in between burnt sienna and raw sienna. Maybe a little bit of amber in there too. I'll be airbrushing this, so I want to thin the lacquer down a bit, and I'll try and sneak up on the correct density of color a drop at a time. You can see it's very thin. The viscosity is like water. But friends, it's not suitable for drinking. And the color intensity is a bit on the weak side, which is what I want, because my first pass here tells me I need a bit more brown in that. It's too orange. Yeah, I got a little bit dark on the back side, but it actually doesn't look nearly this garish under normal lighting. I sprayed on 4 coats of clear gloss, which is just enough to allow me to level sand with 1000 grit in preparation for 2 mistings of satin from a spray can. Your prep has to be good for satin finishes because you can't really go back and sand them without messing it up. This one turned out okay. I'm reasonably happy with that. And like I said, you can still see the inlays, but the shape is right. I think the front of the headstock looks really nice. The repair is obvious, but hopefully it looks like someone took some care in the process. Epiphones almost always require some setup work, even straight from the factory. I guess that's just how they hit the price point. So the nut slots are usually very tall, and with a little fine tuning they can often play much more easily. Alright, let's see what I can play on this thing.